The second point, very briefly, that curious system of capitalism, without going into long history of the maturation, is a very unstable. Not only that it is, as Marx said, a permanent revolution in the development of productive forces, etc., etc., but it is based on two things which cannot continue for a long historical time. One is exponential growth. Exponential growth is the growth of the cancer, and it leads necessarily to death. The ecologists are rediscovering something which was in Marx on that point. The second dimension of that impossibility is the growing, I don't want to go into a debate on wording of things, whether it is underconsumption or over-accumulation, but a growing contradiction between the capacity to produce and the capacity of the absorption by the market with the incomes which are distributed. And therefore, I'm here with Baran, Sweezy, Macduff, but not many other Marxist economists, that this system has the period of high growth, achieving relatively peacefully for a very small minority and a growing minority of humankind at the expense of growing pauperization of the majority. That system cannot function except for short, very short period. In between those short periods, you have long crisis. The system is moved into long crisis in the 19th century already, as of 1871, 72. It's not by pure chance that it was politically questioned very early by the Commune of Paris in 1871. A long first crisis, let's say 1875 to 1950. That's not short. Or to 1945. With the second part of this long crisis being, as I'm saying, a number of minor events: the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the crisis of 29, the fact Nazism, Imperial Japan, the Second World War, the Chinese Revolution, the Yugoslav Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, and the liberation Bandung and the liberation of Asia and Africa. These are small events only, but they are the major things that we have to look into that first long crisis. Now we have started in a second long crisis which started exactly a century after, later. We can put a date. I love dates because possibly it makes things easier to formulate. 1971, with the abolition of the convertibility of the dollar, the flexibility of the currencies in 73, 74, and the rates of growth and investment in the capitalist imperialist centers, the triad, North America, Europe, and Japan, moving down to half of what they had been for a very short period, the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 years following immediately after World War II, 45-75, and never recovered since. We were a limited number of people who wrote in the 70s of last century, the second long crisis has started. People laughed. And we were among those who did not predict by reading in a crystal ball, but say the logic of that system will lead, and what we described, and you can find it signed by Samir Amin and André Gunderfrank in a book published in 1978, we described delocalization, oligopoly, generalized oligopoly, financialization, and things of that kind. which did happen. Which means that the Marxist tool for analyzing reality is not so bad. It allowed us to discover what the most brilliant bourgeois economists could never imagine. But between the first long crisis and the second long one, the capital reacted in the same way, but produced something different, of course. It reacted in the same way, that is, in both cases, by centralization of capital, monopoly, by globalization, expanding and opening new areas and domains for expansion of capitalist investment and exploitation, and financialization. And the three cannot be dissociated from one another. In the first armed response at end of 19th century was perfectly analyzed by Hobson, Hilferding, and Lenin. Globalization is not something new discovered by some fellow travelers of the campuses of North America or elsewhere. Colonization is the most brutal form, a very brutal form of globalization. And financialization, I recalled already that Wall Street and London, City of London, were created at that in response to that first crisis. That created the conditions for a short period, which was called in its time, because French was the elegant language at that time, La Belle Époque, from 1890 or 94 or 95 to the First World War. 2 decades at most. 2 decades at most. Short in history, with discourses which were developed at that time, and which curiously we find, I was reading with pleasure the nonsense which was written at that time, very similar, end of history, democracy, including civilizing people, peace, and so on and so forth. That was very short-lived, and it led to the second half of the long crisis, which I described, those insignificant events, such as global wars, revolutions, etc., etc. Now, in the second, we are now moving from the second wave, second long crisis, from its first stage, including the second Belle Époque, and here again, I was among those, but others also, but we were not many, who wrote in the late 90s, in the early 90s, even 92, I wrote it about the militarization of globalization, and 96 or 98 or 2002 on the coming financial breakdown, which also made most of the bourgeois economists laugh at us, and saying, I wrote in 2002, I have no crystal ball, but that must lead to a financial breakdown before 10 years. It came 6 years later. Now, but there are differences, enormous differences, or important differences between the first and the second one. The centralization of capital, my opinion, I'm not alone, and I have learned from others, and particularly from François Morin on this point. The degree of centralization of capital is qualitatively new and has nothing to do with what it was in the first wave. I qualify it by saying that we have moved into a generalized oligopolies, which means that oligopolies are not just a number of monopolies important, but they are controlling everything. All the economic system at all levels, directly and indirectly, and all the political system. The change in the nature of the state comes from there. That is, for the first time in the history of capitalism, capital, oligopoly, can rule the whole system without a state. But that does not mean without power and without military power also, which means the state. But in a very brutal and direct way. Now, these are a handful. If you take the 500 biggest groups, they control most things. If you take 5,000 and you have almost all of them, they control everything. And it's a handful. That means that we have reached a point where the ruling class of dominant capital is a plutocracy. Again, I don't like the word because it has been used demagogically by the fascists as usually, but it's a reality now. Associated with that, and cannot be dissociated from it, the shift or the qualitative change in the nature of imperialism. All imperialism through the ages, from the beginning of really existing European capitalism. Maybe capitalism could have been different if it had developed in the Chinese way as of the 10th century, maybe, but we are not going to discuss what could have happened in history and did not happen. Was a number of imperialist superpowers in permanent war among themselves. And the page is turned. The page is turned not because the European was tired of killing one another, which is not a bad thing that they were tired of that, not because they discovered their common roots of Christianity, civilization, I don't know what. No, not because they were united for conjunctural political reasons, because they were menaced by Soviet Union or communism, or both of them, but because this degree of centralization of capital creates a common need for capital, for that segment of capital which dominates everything, to manage in common the global system. They cannot manage it through their conflict among themselves. And this is, I label it also, the move to the collective imperialism of the triad. This is why Europe is a vassal of the leader, United States, and so is Japan. But they have the same fundamental interests. The ruling class, the plutocracy. The oligarchy is not a specificity of Russia. Russia is a copy, or trying to be a copy. It's basically the oligarchy of Northern America, US and Canada, and Europe and Japan. Now, that centralization of capital has created that change, which is very important, because if we look at how the second part of the previous long crisis developed, it started with an inter-imperialist war. Now it developed differently, leading to revolutions in the peripheries. At that time, with the hope, it was Lenin's hope, and this was, Lenin was very optimistic and thought that the first long crisis would be the last one, because the revolution in the weak link, which is periphery, or call it semi-periphery if you like, Russia, would be followed by, and quickly, historically quickly, by revolutions in the center. Germany in particular, but not only Germany probably, which did not happen. And not by pure chance or by mistakes of people, but by the logic of this system of polarization. And therefore shifted towards the East. Lenin, who was very realistic and a good analyst of reality, felt it since Baku, 1920. And this is why the Third International was the first real international. The second one was exclusively European also, or Western European even, and Central European, but no more than that. The third one moved to the East, which started also compelling historical Marxism to acquire different facets.